Good evening, and welcome again to the monastery and to the Canadian Orthodox Broadcasting System. I wanted to invite our viewers to go to CanadianOrthodoxBroadcasting.ca and log on to the National Public Radio interview that was done last week and actually played on Monday, this past Monday, the 21st of December at noon on National Public Radio. I wanted to really do a little bit of a takeoff on that broadcast and some of the other subjects that we've covered in recent times. The interesting thing about the struggle over Christmas and whether or not it's being too secularized. We discussed that, of course, on the NPR broadcast. But what I wanted to continue with on the basis of that broadcast and the last one we did on YouTube is to suggest that we're undergoing a new axial period and probably have been since the 1800s. Now I want to explain that a bit for those of you who haven't studied the history of philosophy and that aspect of history in general. The philosopher Karl Jaspers referred to a great axial period, which took place between about 800 and perhaps 400 BC, the era when Prophet Isaiah was writing in Israel, and the time of Confucius, the Azerbaijani prophet Zarathustra, or Zoroaster as he's often called, was working in Persia among the Persians and Medes. And at the time when philosophy itself, pre-scientific philosophy, was developing in Miletus among the Greeks. Now there was an enormous shift in thought in that era, and part of the reason was that because of the growth of civilization and new methods of agriculture and herding, there began to be a luxury of time for certain classes of people. So an intellectual class began to develop among the upper class, people who had leisure, and began to think about the interaction of human beings within cultures and societies and how to stabilize and improve that. So ethical systems began to be created in that era, and laws had been developing for, probably since 1000 BC. But the development of law and the reshaping of philosophical and religious views was enormous. A lot of older mythologies were being reinterpreted in a way that gave a system of philosophy, a system of ethics, and what would develop into a system of moral codes for interhuman interaction. And beginning in the 1800s, building on what had transpired in the 1700s, the Renaissance coming out of the Dark Ages, coming out of the medieval era, the Industrial Revolution, a huge shift in paradigms began to take place. And that shift was still rooted in philosophy at the time, and the ideas of philosophers would, over a long period of time, begin to trickle down into the general population and shape the way that societies, populations actually thought, and the emotional and psychological directions that they traveled. A lot of the major ideas that pressed into society originated in a small philosophical circle and then began to spread out through instruction, through the newly developing school systems and so forth. Now toward the beginning of the 1900s, that is the 20th century, a major shift took place in that the physicists and other scientists began to capture the imagination of people far more than philosophers had done. And while philosophy remained important, it more or less shifted now into the social sciences, whereas physics, science, became somewhat less philosophical and more hard science. But we also began to have superstar scientists and physicists, people like Einstein, Boltzmann, Planck, and these others, who really influenced society a great deal. So the trickle-down now began to come from the sciences, from physicists, rather than from the philosophers. So we had a shift in the way of thinking. And in previous centuries, Christian writers and thinkers had followed the pattern set by the philosophers in trying to present the Christian message. And this became quite fixed in the way one approached theology, particularly in the West, but also in the East, under the influence of Western scholasticism as well. And now we have this shift away from the philosophers, and the scientists begin to shape the way society and culture actually think, began to shape the paradigms of society. And passing through the two world wars into the nuclear age, we had this continuation of this developing new axial period. I would like to call it a new axial period anyway, where we shifted first into the philosophers and ethicists, and now we shift from the philosophers and ethicists into the scientists, the physicists, and the geneticists. And so that the whole way that society is thinking now is technological, scientific. It's no longer philosophical. So the philosophical presentation of the faith no longer carries much weight and really has very little resonance with a generation that has grown up now in the technological scientific era. So that we ourselves have to respond to this new axial period. And the way we present the faith, the way we present the teachings of the faith, so that we're shifting away from the philosophical mode and into the mode in which society is actually thinking, the mode which has a resonance with the modern society. And we're not talking about modernism. We're talking about a mode of expression and a mode of expressing and exchanging ideas and of putting forth concepts and ideas which can actually resonate with people who no longer think along the philosophical modes, but think along the modes of science and genetics, particularly physics and genetics. And I'd like to suggest that Christian apologists and those who are presenting Christianity to the world around us in this 21st century need also to recognize that we have been undergoing this radical new axial period, and that we need to change our modes of presentation, our modes of communication, of communicating the faith in ways that can be understood and comprehended more and responded to more by a generation for which the old modes and terms of expression are essentially meaningless and have no real resonance. This axial period that we're passing into requires a great deal of effort on our part to evangelize, to expand the understanding of the Orthodox Christian faith, and to really make it something that can speak to and attract this generation in this new axial period. So what I want to press upon people this evening is that dramatic and dynamic shift in the first axial period is being repeated now in a second axial period. And the shift is very dynamic and very dramatic, and we have to respond to it.